Hi, and welcome to this special edition of Love and the Planets, the forecast year ahead for 2018. I'm Armand Diaz in New York.
And I'm Margaret Gray in Dublin, Ireland.
Margaret, it's a busy year. It starts off very busy. It starts off actually with Uranus stationing direct on January 2nd. And we have eclipses in January and into February. What's your highlight for the year, though?
My highlight for the year is without a doubt Uranus moving into Taurus. I think this is very important for relationships because, of course, Taurus is ruled by Venus, and Venus is one of the key, planets to do with relationships. So I think this is really important. Now, to say that he goes into Taurus on May 15th, going to be there until 2025, and just to notice that the last time that Uranus was in Taurus was between 1935 and 1942. So I would suggest it's worth looking back into your family history, see what was going on in the family history at that time, because we're focusing on relationships today. So we're not looking at this in a mundane way. We're really looking at how might it affect your relationship. So look at what was going on maybe with parents, with family, with, going back wherever and see what was happening there. So what do you think? I mean, what's your highlight, Armand, in terms of relationships for this year?
Well, I got a couple of candidates there we'll have to get to. I think that Chiron moving into Aries on April 17th is a significant one. He's going to, like Uranus, going to dip back into the other signs. He's going to get back into Pisces for a little bit. But, Chiron, woundedness, healing, where we suffer, it's really accentuated in Pisces. And I think that going into Aries, it shifts the focus a little bit. It perhaps takes away some of that sense of hopelessness that can go with Chironic suffering. But what do you think about Chiron and Aries?
Well, I think that, it's about really healing that part of us that, the individuation part of us. So that part of us that has not individuated. I think in Pisces, it was very much about, the part that's still merged. And in Aries, it's like, okay, we've got to grow up. We've got to become separate human beings. So I think in relationships, I think the issue about maybe codependency, might continue into Aries, but in a very different way than Pisces. So where people think, oh, it's time to heal that. I'm okay. So it moves on a step. It's a new beginning. So I think it's potentially very exciting, really, actually. What do you think, Armand, as well about Venus retrograde? I know we'll go back to Uranus and Taurus, but what's your sense of the Venus retrograde this year? I mean, it's retrograde from October 5th to November 16th, and it goes from Scorpio to Libra. And of course, we know it opposes Uranus for one of those times. So what are your thoughts?
Well, it opposes Uranus 3 times, once in the shadow of the retrograde, once during the retrograde, and once after the retrograde. Now, Uranus and Taurus, you want to know what it means in your relationship. Look at this period of time to see how this is playing out. It seems to me that it's an interesting dynamic because when you have Venus and when you have Venus and Uranus in opposition, it's a little bit of us versus me. It's the sort of what's an individual, what's a group. But, in the sign of Taurus, it's not like, we're used to Uranus being in Aries, which is, very independent. It really reinforces that Uranian energy. It's a little different in Taurus. And then Venus is in Scorpio, and that's not necessarily the sign where she is the most outgoing. There's great protective energy there. And then she's retrograding back into Libra. I really get the feeling that it's a tug of war within relationship a little bit, rather than that sense of independence versus relationship. This is kind of like, where are we going?
Also, just to mention, that during a Venus retrograde, it's not the ideal time to sign a marriage contract. Venus also rules contracts. And so when she's retrograde, it's really a time to rethink about things. But sometimes if contracts are signed, problems can arise later. So if you can avoid it, know in advance that is not the best time to do that, particularly with the Uranus opposition, because again, there can be a little bit, I would call it a little bit maybe destabilizing. So I think, there's, and Uranus moving into Taurus, I think in terms of relationship, just to go back to that a second, I think is an interesting one, because relationships really thrive on some basis of security. We want that attachment, we want that security, we want to know that we can trust our beloved, we can that there's that emotional attachment, we want comfort, we want sensuality, all of those things which Taurus rules. And then Uranus comes along and says, okay, but now we're going to do this a little differently. And so I think the challenge is going to be for everybody in relationships is, how do we do these basic security needs differently in our relationships? So how do we create relationships that are based on a different kind of security? And I think that, a lot is going to depend on how earthy the relationship is, how earthy is the composite chart, how earthy are the two individuals together. And I think for people who have very earthy charts, particularly composites that are very earthy, this might just be a little bit like the ground is wobbling underneath.
The other thing is, too, when we get into a retrograde type of period, there's often a sort of compulsion for a relationship. When we always say, well, when Venus is retrograde, it's really not the best time to begin a relationship because the energy goes more internally. And yet it's the time when a planet's retrograde, it's the time when you sort of want to do that thing. And so from September through November, there might be, for those who are not in a relationship, there might be a sense of, wow, this is a great new relationship. It may seem, especially between Libra and Scorpio, to meet all kinds of needs. This is, seem like the perfect relationship. And then Uranus gets in there and sort of says, well, not quite.
Also, not forgetting as well that we've got a Mars retrograde this year. So just to throw that into the pod, and now that's going to be from June to August, and it goes from Aquarius to the end of Capricorn. So, this is actually, Mars is going to be the closest that it's ever been to Earth, since 2003. And I think the Mars retrograde is more likely to affect relationships with family, relationships with friends. I think there's that tribal feeling attached to it. So I think, it's a little bit detached. So we may not feel terribly emotional or terribly, connected to intimacy during that time. What's your sense of that Mars retrograde, Armand, for relationship?
I'm just picturing when because it is, the Mars is going to be close to the Earth. They're going to be all of those little pictures of Mars, like as big as the moon or something like that people always put up. It'll be brighter, but that's about it. I tend to agree, and I think the Aquarian emphasis it reminds me very much of what I guess the takeaway from the Venus opposite Uranus suggests to me, which is there's an air of experimentation, of give it a try, of enjoy it, see where things go, but be aware with the Mars retrograde as well as the Venus retrograde that, maybe things aren't going to be exactly what you expect and not exactly what you think. So, give it a shot, see what happens, but don't necessarily expect it to be so, as planned.
Very true. Now, we've got also a couple of other things that we want to get in there, that Jupiter, of course, remains in Scorpio most of the year, but it does go into Sagittarius November 8th. So I think that may bring a desire for more freedom, more expansion in relationships, and there are two Jupiter-Neptune trines. One is from May 25th to June 13th, the other August 11th to August 25th. So I think this is pretty powerful because, of course, Jupiter is the old ruler of Pisces. So I think it's quite a strong energy that can really push us towards, that idea of unconditional love. That's my hope, at least, that it can open us more to that. It can expand us more to that. What do you think?
Jupiter in Scorpio certainly is intimacy, and Neptune in Pisces is more unconditional, more expansive, more universal. And so the two in relationship to each other can certainly signify a kind of unconditional love. Also perhaps an awareness of a of a more spiritual dimension to things, a little bit less of the what am I getting out of this in terms of any relationship, and a little bit more in terms of, here we all are as participants in this drama, and how can we sort of help each other along.
Which is kind of really important, isn't it? Fundamental, I think, to relationships and kind of the direction we really want to be going. And speaking of directions, the North Node enters Cancer, of course, on November 7th, 2018, and remains there until May 2020. So we're going to change into that Cancer Capricorn axis where, we've got self-nurturing versus boundaries versus perfection. It really is encouraging. Again, it's in line with that Jupiter Neptune in terms of much more nurturing and self-love and loving each other.
I think so. What we have with the nodes are always opposite each other. And, with Leo, there's that sense of, what am I doing in North Node Leo coming from the heart, and then South Node in Aquarius, what's the demands of the group? And then we shift over into Cancer, it becomes a little bit more, it's less about me individually, more about us, group, clan. And then Capricorn, some of the structures of society, the structures and the expectations. And I mean, I think at its best, this speaks to being able to connect on a more organic level and away from some of our expectations.
I think overall, Armand, looking at next year, I think one of the big things is that we are finally moving completely away from the Uranus-Pluto square, which has kind of dominated the picture really since 2012 and way before that. And I think has created, did create a lot of havoc in many relationships. Many relationships split up during that time because it was just so challenging. It was just that real conflict in the sky. So even though Uranus, of course, in Taurus is not, also has its challenges, but I think it does break that pattern. And I think overall the transits bring us more in tune with, what's love about and how can we love each other in a more nurturing way without such a lot of erratic energy around to kind of really jostle us back and forth. That's my overall sense for relationships.
I would tend to agree with you to a point. I do think that both the Venus retrograde and some of the aspects on a more mundane level, it's not the Uranus-Pluto square, but there's stuff going on out there in the collective that will impinge upon our personal relationships as well. And I think it's important to recognize when that's happening. I think that, there's a sense sometimes that it's all about, you and me personally, but sometimes it's about what's going on in the bigger picture and how that's affecting us.
So true. And to have the tools as couples and as families and as friendship groups, and to really navigate those, those transits. And that's really part of the work we do, of course, on a weekly basis, is just to talk about the transits and suggest some ways that we can all navigate them to, to just really get the best out of them.
So we'll be unpacking all of this throughout 2018.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. Happy New Year, Armand.
Happy New Year, Margaret.